Today's sewing project is a beautiful and elegant layering piece. This is the Westmore Cardigan by Cashmerette. It's a fit and flare style cardigan that's all about casual elegance. There are two front styles to choose from for this project. You can choose the cascading waterfall finish or choose the rolled shawl collar. I will be demonstrating both styles in this video. I hope you sew along with me. Let's get started. Place your side front and center front pieces right sides together, matching the notches and pin in place. And repeat for the opposite center and side front pieces. And do the same to attach the side front to the center front for view B as well. For both front bodice sections. Then we're going to sew from the top of that seam straight down to the bottom. Use a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a zigzag stitch with a length of 2.5 and a width of 0.5. Do this for both sets and then finish the raw edges. Then we can open out that seam and press those seam allowances toward the side front piece. Place your side back pieces on their corresponding center back sides, right sides together, matching your notches, and pin in place. Sew both side back pieces to the center back using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and that narrow zigzag stitch, and then finish the raw edges. In the same way for view B. And then press those seam allowances toward the center back. Place one pocket right sides together with its corresponding side front piece, matching the notches and pin in place. Using your narrow zigzag stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew from the top of the pocket to the bottom. Then you can finish the seam allowance of this section only and then press the seam flat. And repeat to attach the opposite pocket to the opposite side front. Flip that pocket over its seam allowance and give that a press. Then we're going to understitch this pocket. We're going to sew the pocket to its seam allowance underneath at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from top to bottom, and do this for both side front pockets. Now we're going to attach our pockets to the side back panels in the same exact way as we did for the front, placing the corresponding pocket and side backs right sides together, matching your notches, and pin in place. And do this for both pockets on both sides. Then sew each pocket in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from top to bottom and finish the raw edges of this section. Then you can press the seam flat. Then flip those pockets over their seam allowance. Give them a press, and then understitch from top to bottom with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here is the right side of one of my front bodice pieces, and we're going to reinforce our top corner, starting about an inch above that corner point, and then stopping our stitching about an inch away from the bottom of the corner point. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, pivoting at the corner, using a small straight stitch. And repeat that stay stitching for your opposite front bodice piece. And then using sharp scissors, we're going to snip to the corner of our stitching, being very careful not to snip through the stitching line. And once again, repeating for both front bodice pieces. And repeat to reinforce the same inner corners for view B. Now place both of your front bodice pieces right sides together, matching that top edge of the center back extension, and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance with a 2.5 millimeter straight stitch. And repeat the same steps for view B. Then we can open out that seam. And for view A only, we're going to trim one side of the seam allowance down to an 1/8 of an inch. Then fold the untrimmed seam allowance right sides together with itself by 1/4 inch and give that a good press. Once you've folded and pressed that intact seam allowance, shift it right along that seam line so that now all of the raw edges are enclosed, and give that a good press. Now that I have that pressed in place, I'm choosing to edge stitch close to that folded edge from one side to the other with a regular straight stitch. For view B, we're going to trim both sides of the seam allowance to 3/8 of an inch and then press that seam open. Now here's the right side of that center back extension opened out flat. And now we're going to place the front and back pieces right sides together along the shoulders and back neckline. And those snips that we made earlier to the stay stitching will help us open out this area where the back neckline meets the shoulder so that it opens out flat. Pin the shoulders and back neckline in place, matching your princess seams. Then sewing from the front of the garment, starting from one end of the shoulder seam, we're going to sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance using a regular straight stitch. Sew from one side to that very corner where your stay stitching ended, and then slightly pivot the stitching to sew around the curve of the back neckline. And once you get to the bottom of that snipped area once again, slightly pivot to continue stitching to the end of the opposite shoulder. Once it's sewn, finish the raw edges and press the seam allowance toward the back of the garment. And repeat to attach the front and back bodices for view B. Here is the right side of my front and back bodice pieces opened out at the shoulder seam. I'm going to place the corresponding sleeve right sides together with the arm side, first matching the notch at the top of the sleeve with the shoulder seam and pinning in place. And then continue pinning the sleeve in place. Then sew the sleeve in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance using your narrow zigzag stitch, and then you can finish the raw edges and press the seam toward the sleeve. And repeat to attach both sleeves. Now fold one of the sleeves right sides together with itself. Also place that corresponding front and back bodice piece right sides together, as well as their pockets. Then we can start by pinning that underarm seam, the side seams, and all around the pockets. Then using your narrow zigzag stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance starting at the bottom of the sleeve, we're going to sew that underarm seam straight down to the top of the pocket, and then pivot around the pocket to continue with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, all the way around the pocket, pivoting once again at the bottom of the pocket and continuing to the bottom of the garment. Once all of that is sewn, finish the raw edges and press the seam allowance toward the front. And then repeat all of those steps to complete the opposite underarm seam and side seam. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice piece. We're going to flip the pocket so that it's laying on top of the front bodice piece, laying out the pocket so that it's perfectly flat. Then I'm going to hand tack the pocket bag to the center front seam allowance, making sure to sew through the seam allowance only so that the stitches are not visible from the outside of the garment. I'm just using a needle and thread, and I'm going to sew at the top of the pocket bag, the middle, and at the bottom. And follow the exact same steps for your opposite pocket. I'm choosing to leave the raw edges of the waterfall edge raw, since the knit that I'm using is not going to fray. I'm also going to be leaving the raw edges for the bottom hem raw as well. For view B, for your remaining center front pieces, we're going to reinforce those upper corners in the same way as we did earlier, starting our stitching 1 inch above the corner and then pivoting and continuing to the outer edge, just using a short straight stitch for both upper corners. Once the corners are reinforced, place these center front pieces right sides together and pin the center back edge, and then sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance using a regular straight stitch. And then open out that seam and trim the seam allowances down to 3/8 of an inch. And then press that seam allowance open. Now we're going to place the outer edges of the center front facing right sides together with the side front pieces of the main cardigan. Pin in place all around the center front and back neck. And then starting at one bottom edge of the cardigan, we're going to sew all the way around with a narrow zigzag stitch, ending at the opposite bottom edge of the cardigan. Once it's sewn, press your seam allowances open. Once those seams are pressed, we're going to flip that facing to the inside of the garment and press those seams once again, all the way around the center front and back neckline. Here is the bottom center front edge of one of my front bodice pieces. Before I top stitch the center front, I'm going to prepare the hem in a way that's different from the pattern instructions. I'm going to flip the facing so that it's once again right sides together with the front bodice, flipping it right along that seam line. And then I'm going to pin along the bottom edge just as far as the facing. And then I'll sew the bottom edge just as far as the facing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, using my narrow zigzag stitch. And I'm going to repeat for both center fronts. Then I'll turn that center front edge right side out, poking out the corner, repeating for the opposite center front. Then I'll take the cardigan back to the ironing board and press that bottom hem to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch all the way across. Now that the bottom hem is pressed, we're ready to top stitch all around the center front and bottom edges. Starting at the top of the cardigan at the center back, I'm going to be using a long straight stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, continuing all around the center front and pivoting at the bottom edge to top stitch the bottom hem. Just top stitching straight across, pivoting at the opposite bottom center front corner, and then coming around to stop the stitching where we started, back stitching to secure. Now, just as we did to secure the pockets to the inside of the garment, we're going to secure the inner edge of the facing to the center front and back neckline seam allowances. Doing this on either side of the center back, at the tops of each shoulder, as well as 3 times down the center front. And doing that for both center fronts. And for the bottoms of the sleeves, I'm going to turn the raw edges to the wrong side by 1 inch and pin in place all the way around. Doing this for the bottoms of both sleeves. Then I'm going to sew my hems in place just using a zigzag stitch. And I did the same to hem both sleeves for view B. And now your jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew-along. Make sure you check out the rest of my video library for more great full-length sew-alongs, and I'll see you in the next video.